What I've been trying to do today is to look at the underlying forces that have been shaping patterns of global insecurity and instability. What I've been trying to do in the talk is to move beyond the very common kind of discussions that have occurred around these sorts of issues, which tend to be very symptomatic. They tend to focus on particular conflicts, the manifestations of particular forms of violence. And instead, what I've been trying to do in the talk is to ask what kind of international system produces these kinds of patterns of violence. So, for example, two facts that are interesting here. We have in the present international system, we have a dramatic decline in the incidence of traditional interstate wars. So the old-fashioned things that armies were designed to deal with, wars between states over territories, dynastic marriages, etc., that form of violence has declined dramatically over the last 50 years. And particularly when you put that in the context of relationship between instances of that sort of war and the number of states in the international system. So over that period, the number of states has quadrupled, but the actual number of wars has declined. So the ratio has dramatically altered, which is really a very significant achievement for an international system such as ours. However, over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase, not a huge increase, but a notable one, an increase in what we call violence of anti-systemic movements, of which Al-Qaeda is probably a good example. So this is violence committed by groups, often transnationally, in opposition to the nature of the political, economic and cultural order itself. So what I'm interested in is the question of how do we understand those big patterns of violence, and what is it about the international system today that is producing those kinds of phenomena? Some good, the decline of interstate violence is a real plus. We've got to understand that, hold on to it, embrace it, cherish it. But we also want to know what it is about the system that's producing these other patterns of violence. Two of these things are sources for me. One of them is that most of my work is on big transformations in the international system. So a lot of my writing has been about the evolution of the system of sovereign states, the factors that produced it and might be transforming it over time. So this approach is very much consistent with the kind of work I generally do. But it also arose out of a general frustration with much of the debate about international security after 9/11. Much of this debate has been very symptomatic. There's been an industry emerge of kind of terrorism studies, which much of it which is concerned with the manifestations, surface manifestations, concerned with the nature of particular terrorist organisations, the kinds of techniques they use, the various organisational forms they adopt, all of which are important and significant questions, but they do leave unstated the kind of deeper questions about the systemic forces that produce these kinds of violence in the first place. And that's what interests me, partly because I think that for policy practitioners, we need to get policy right. We need not only to be addressing those surface manifestations, but we need to be thinking about deeper issues. For example, one of the questions that was made taboo after 9/11 was the question about whether there's any connection between the rise of transnational forms of terrorism and questions of global development and economic impoverishment, political alienation. And this was a taboo question because, of course, that put the issue back on questions for which we might have some responsibility, which is questions of global distributive justice, the nature of our political institutions, states, etc. I think these are fundamental questions that we need to understand, and in fact we run the risk of perpetuating processes that produce these forms of violence unless we can get an adequate conceptualization. What I'd like to do in the next one is to take a bridge into some of the other work that I'm doing here, which is on the role of individual rights in world politics. And again, what I'm interested in is moving away from the traditional discussions about human rights in world politics, which are very much about the question of whether or not the present international human rights regime makes a difference in world politics, What I'm interested in fact I'm finishing a book on this now, is on the role that individual rights and struggles over individual rights have played in the much longer history of the international system. In fact, I have a very controversial argument that the nature of the international system is in part a product of those transformations. And what I'd like to do is to think about what the implications of that bigger argument about rights and world politics is for thinking about the future of human rights in the contemporary world, which is an issue that goes to the heart of our regional organisations, our regional legal systems, but also the development of our international institutions. And I'd like to pull out some of those strands if I get an opportunity.